Hello and welcome from London. How much anger and frustration is bubbling under the surface in Britain, particularly with a generation of young people desperate for work? The evidence is becoming all too clear that there is a dire future with no prospects for much of Britain's youth, and they're starting to rebel. With nearly 1 million young people unemployed in the UK, the jobless rate for adults aged 25 and under has reached 20%, the highest level since the government began tracking this age group. The outlook is even worse under the latest tough austerity measures, which have abolished the Educational Maintenance Allowance, or EMA, and the Future Jobs Fund, which will also come to an end this March. The squeeze on Britain's young people is leading many to wonder if they are destined to become a lost generation. So on today's show we ask, what should the government do to empower the rising number of educated but unemployed youth, and how can a path be set for a more stable future? Remember, you can join our conversation with your questions and comments. You can send an SMS or an email. Well, my guest today, our journalist Shiv Malik, who argues that young Britons today face the most uncertain future of any group since the early 1930s. He co-authored Jilted Generation, How Britain Has Bankrupted Its Youth. Also here is Usman Ali, Vice President for Higher Education with the National Union of Students, where he works to promote progressive funding for those seeking higher education. Previously, Mr. Ali served as President at the University of Salford's Student Union. And my third guest is Ben Howlett, Chairman of Conservative Future, which is effectively the youth wing of the ruling Conservative Party. Mr. Howlett agrees that the country is facing difficult choices, but feels there is cause for optimism once fiscal adjustments are made. Gentlemen, I welcome you all to the show.
Thank you.
Shiv Malik, if I could start with you and ask, your book refers to the jilted generations, and I wonder if you could explain in what way are they jilted?
Well, in the way that, how we define it really is those born after 1979. And really the line is, the division line, is about those who had to pay student fees. That first generation had to pay student fees and those didn't. And that really explains kind of what we mean. It's those who are sort of having to go into the adult world with a lot of the benefits that were previously there stripped away from them. So whether it's student fees or paying extra for housing, paying extra for rents, finding it very difficult to get a stable job, that kind of a thing. Suddenly adult life is, very difficult to attain.
Was it really that clear a line, 1979?
Well, I mean, that's the line that we chose.
Yeah.
And actually, if you look at it that way, you suddenly find that a lot of things fit into that, including the way the government wants to regulate pensions. That's the line in which the sort of those, going to the next 30, 40 years will be paying those working even longer. And that's actually, that's the very date that they also chose, sort of working back, which is also curious, but there we go.
Well, Usman Ali, I was mentioning in the introduction how young people are starting to rebel. At least they're coming out on the streets, and we've seen that recently in Britain. Of course, it was back in even 2006 in France that protesters were tear-gassed, and they were demonstrating in Italy last year. Now we've got the students out on the streets in Britain very angry about the EMA, the Educational Maintenance Allowance, and of course the Future Jobs Fund. Now, how likely are we to see more of this? How much more do you feel young people are going to mobilise? Is that the sense you get among students?
I feel that students are still going to mobilise. Obviously, they're angry about the issues, they're angry about their future as well. The national demonstration, which the NUS organised back in November, we had 52,000 people there from all across the country, and this is the biggest demonstration that we've seen in a generation. And we have one coming up in Manchester as well, and we've purposely picked Manchester, one because it has the biggest higher education institute in the country, and secondly because it has the biggest further education institute in the country as well. But also in terms of the northwest, that's where the biggest unemployment rates are within the country as well. So naturally students are calling for us to protest. Obviously NUS condemns any acts of violence which take place at the protests.
Yeah, that's what surprised people, is how violent things became. Why is that? Why do they take that kind of tone?
I think from their point of view, they're not being listened to. The government's not listening to their voice as well. Obviously, I would disagree with that. Obviously, the protests are there, and the majority of people who came into those protests were there to raise their concerns in a peaceful way, and were there, to ultimately raise their voices, make it heard, but in a peaceful way.
Ben Howlett, of course, these young people out on the streets protesting are a young generation of voters, and I wonder to what degree the political world recognises these are future voters.
Yeah, absolutely. There are a large amount of people which are not exactly happy with what the government's pursuing, but what we've got to do is go out there and tell them what the message is, which is let's be frank, over the last 13 years, maybe even longer, we've had a massive problem with the economy. The economy is going downhill. We've got to make some very, very difficult choices which aren't exactly the nicest choices to have made. You know, 5-10 years ago, I would have loved to have gone out there and say, yeah, absolutely, there's money in the pot, we're able to spend it. There isn't any money around in order to spend on additional higher education funding, so therefore we need to spread the load in a fair way as well. So let's look at the longer term.
It may sound like a cliche, but it is the poorest that get hit the most. And I wonder how much this will lead to a downward spiral where you end up with a real, division in society, the haves and have-nots, and of course growing frustration there.
There's a lot of rhetoric from the left that the poorest are going to be hit the worst. I completely disagree with that. I think some of the proposals that have been made by the government have been incredibly progressive. There are some proposals in there, such as it actually costing less per month if you're paying if you're paying back your fees beyond £21,000, it's going to be actually less than it was under the previous system. So it'll actually help the poor in effect. And don't forget, the debts are going to be written off after a certain amount of time anyway.
And of course, I came up through a grant system. So for me, it seems so strange Britain would suddenly have, fees, and as they do in America, where obviously I'm based now. But an email question to you, actually, Shiv, if I may, that came in from Los Angeles in California, from Aqua Godi, who wrote in saying, the frustration and social unrest resulting from education cuts should lead to political action from youth around the world. We've seen there seems to be a whole uprising around the world, from Tunisia now, and we're seeing murmurs of it happening in other places like Algeria and Egypt and so on. But it seems people are mobilizing, and in most cases it is young people.
That's right, it is young people, and I think actually the system that we've grown up with in the last 30 years has told us sort of one thing. This is all about aspiration. This is about bettering yourself. And you know what? If you work hard, we're going to remove all the other basic things that happened before. So for your parents, they had security somewhat, and we provide for all these things. But for you, for this generation, we're going to say, well, look, there's things called aspiration. So if you work hard, you study hard, you pass your exams, go to university, be able to do all of those things, you'll end up with a decent quality of life. And actually, that's turned out to basically be a complete myth. Young people have realised that isn't working for them suddenly, or all of a sudden, with this downturn. And that's actually, I think, the root cause of why they're getting upset.
Are you surprised how aggressive they've become? These protests. You got bashed on the head, I gather, at one rally.
I did get bashed on the head. I mean, I went there as a journalist, and obviously, being a journalist, you have to be up at the front line. So I got hit around the head, and that was a sort of a messy-ish incident. But there was a lot of violence, and a lot of violence from both sides. And actually, one of the most disturbing sights I saw was not actually sort of police violence, so that was there too, but from a group of 16-year-old girls who were carrying bricks in their hands. And at the point at which you see sort of young girls carrying bricks in their hands, willing to throw them at police officers, you know something's going terribly wrong.
Of course, we're seeing people setting themselves on fire in other parts of the world.
That's right,
as well.
absolutely, absolutely.
Usman Ali, one thing is, it seems again, that it is certain sectors in society, students and young people, who are feeling the pressure the most. And of course, I remember a time at university planning ahead. I'll have a job, and maybe I'll look towards getting a house and having some security. Now, of course, the young people are finding it much harder to get onto the property ladder. It's changed a lot, and of course, there's perhaps less sense of job security or even dwindling job prospects. Now, I wonder what kind of echoes you hear in the student community about where they see their futures going.
I think a lot of young people are still uncertain in terms of the future and what lies in the future as well. A lot of them were brought up, especially in terms of the push for widening participation, to have the aspiration to go to university, and now they're finding there's a cap which has been put on institutions, when institutions themselves are saying that they can accept a lot more students as well, especially from widening participation backgrounds. So they've been brought up with this aspiration and been told to go to university, then finding that there's no places to go to university, cuts to education, cuts to leaving university with approximately now £40,000 worth of debt, cuts to the EMA, cuts to projects like the Aim Higher, which encourages people from the poorest backgrounds to go to university. So it's then getting them to question in terms of the future, and as you said before as well, it's close to 1 million in terms of unemployment rate from people from 18 to 24 years old. So a lot of them are questioning the future and what the future holds in terms of higher education.
Now, Ben Hallett, of course, this is the future generation, this is the future of the country, and of course it needs to be addressed. And I wonder, when you look at perhaps creating prospects? Is it something the public sector, the governments can take up and say, okay, we will try and adjust for the lack of jobs and so on? Or is it something that the government now says, well, it's the public sector, sorry, the private sector and businesses that will have to start creating jobs for people?
Absolutely. We've seen over the last 13 years, I would say, since Labour came in, a great push for more public sector investment. It hasn't worked. We've seen the economy falter as a result. We're in one of the worst economic circumstances, and Labour's left us with one of the largest structural deficits in peacetime Britain. That hasn't worked.
Can it be blamed just on one government, though? Because isn't this something that's happened over a number of decades rather than just a short period of time?
Well, actually, in terms of the amount of private investment, prior to Labour, it actually increased, and what we're trying to do now as a government is increase private investment again, putting the emphasis back on growth, putting the emphasis back on getting people into jobs again, and a lot of businesses are promoting exactly what the government's doing at the moment.
An email to you, actually, again, Shiv here, Shiv Malik, from Tunisia, and Rem Trabelsi wrote in saying, unemployment is a global issue. While governments should offer support, young people should also take initiative and start their own businesses. Haven't young people become more entrepreneurial in recent years? I mean, helped a lot by the technology sector, allowing people to branch out and try new things. But hasn't there been a move towards people expecting less in terms of long-term career paths and being a little more independent themselves anyway?
I think they are incredibly independent. I think they are entrepreneurial. We are, if you look at the statistics, really, you know, the most educated generation ever in human history. And I think we're sort of proving that in being able to do and develop new technologies and get involved in things and going out there. But at the same time, you see, if governments or if society, let's put it that way, doesn't in the end provide for some basic things, like the ability to sort of, you know, start your life without massive amounts of debt, with the ability to sort of have a place to live, then people find it increasingly difficult to do the basic things. And if the basic things cost a lot, then people don't take those risks. You see, they don't go out into the world and say, okay, I'm going to take those risks, I'm going to try my hand at this, because they're too worried about what will happen if something goes wrong. They'll lose everything.
There's a sense also, Usman Ali, that the education system is archaic, that it's not really structured for the modern world, that it's built for an industrial age where it's, you know, the clocking in 9 to 5, and a number of people have come out with this idea that the education system needs to be changed to be more flexible, to allow people to build skills across a variety of areas, not just do the traditional, you know, engineering and sciences and stuff, but, you know, more creative stuff as well, in order to be better prepared for work, and that might actually help the situation.
Sure. Obviously, the education system that we had in place was based on the old Russell Group traditional types of universities, and now education has expanded. Obviously, before we had 10% of the population going to university, now we have over 43%, and obviously that's brought a whole different variety of students which now go to university. 1 in 3 are now part-time students, 1 in 5 are postgrad students, and 1 in 10 study higher education and further education institutes. And as a result, the education as a whole has to change. And what the education system has at the moment is a lot of inequalities in higher education. The type of student which will go to Oxford and Cambridge will be completely different, which went to my old institution, the University of Salford, and the diversity will be completely different as well. And NUS offered a fairer alternative and other alternatives to the fees going up between £6,000 to £9,000, where we introduced a graduate tax system which was fully costed, and over time it showed that if it was put into place, that over 20 years there'd be £6 billion which then could be used back into higher education. So this idea of there was no money, which is put forward by the coalition government, there were other alternatives which were put forward, which were not even looked into as well.
Ben Hallett, you were shaking your head there.
Yeah, in terms of the graduate tax, I don't think it is actually a more progressive system. You end up having to pay the graduate tax back as a minimum wage earner. I don't think that's fair. I think what the coalition has said is we actually are going to set the cap at £21,000, which is a great distinction from £6,000. Why should someone from a poorer background be disadvantaged like that? And I don't think quite the NUS got their head around that.
Well, let me get a quick question to you, actually, Ben, from that came in from Germany by email from Christ-Jan Erik Chako, who wrote in saying, austerity is putting women and children at severe risk. It is the religion of money-hungry bankers and politicians. And I wonder, have governments started to hurt the wrong people, in the sense that it's the people at the bottom of the ladder that often seem to bear the brunt? This goes back to what we were talking about earlier, but the policies are often set by those who are at the top of the ladder.
Yeah, what we're trying to do is completely make everyone involved in this one process. Every single country across the world is facing an economic downturn, whether you're at the poorest of the ladder or the highest of the ladder. We need to make sure that the poorest are protected here. Yes, the bankers, we have set a levy on the bankers as a result of what their policies were prior to the coalition, and exactly what we need to be doing is ensuring that those people at the bottom are protected by redistributing some kind of wealth.
Although in the news it's been pretty bad news to hear bankers are suddenly getting huge bonuses again at the time when things are bad. I mean, in terms of publicity, it's certainly not very good.
No, absolutely. So what we need to do is ensure that we reiterate to the bankers that they are also a part of the wider problem of the recession itself, and actually redistribute some of that and protect the poorest people in society as a result.
Shiv Malik, in getting your perspective, I want to put an email to you that came in from South Africa.
We're getting a lot of emails.
Well, we do, and we get our viewers' views in here because that's the idea,
great.
to try to get views from around the world. And from South Africa, now Sheena Mohammed in Johannesburg wrote in saying, "It seems that austerity measures are having far deeper consequences than previously thought. With less investment in human capital, possibilities will surely narrow in the future." And adds to the downward spiral then.
It really does. I mean, if you take what's happened in the US and the UK over the last 30 years. You know, Ben was mentioning that actually it was just the Labour government that was responsible for this downturn. Well, actually, we've invested only 5% of our GDP in sort of capital. We have the lowest investment rates in the whole of Europe, in the whole of the developed world, according to the OECD. And that's really a sort of endemic of this kind of short-termist culture, you know, about the rich sort of take all. Those at the top sort of owning, you know, factories and capital and that kind of thing. They take all the money and they don't want to really invest back into people. And what the effect of that has been is that those coming up, the youngest, who are entering the workforce, have found that there's nothing left for them. And sort of almost everything being stripped bare. You know, the cupboards are empty, and it's a long process that's taken place to have culminated with that effect.
Could it be said, though, that the old system was too rigid and didn't allow people flexibility, that having shorter contracts and having a more flexible system allows people to gravitate towards their natural skills and perhaps even be able to change careers and do more?
That's right, there are benefits in that, but the thing is that, you know, if you're going to lumber people with, you know, 50, 30, 40,000 pounds worth of debt, then that's suddenly, you know, just to get an education, when, you know, you've told people all along, you know, you're going to be competing in a globalized economy, you have to be, you know, education, education, education. And then you heap them with this debt, it becomes increasingly difficult for young people to actually go out there and compete. And you know, we're the only country doing this. We're the only country cutting away from our young in the way that we are. Other countries around the world, certainly sort of in Europe, aren't doing the same thing. You know, George Osborne, our Chancellor, was very pleased and with making those promises to the older generation, saying, yes, we will keep your winter fuel allowances and all those other benefits, so, you know, free NHS prescriptions, and the list goes on and on and on. But actually, when it came to young people, he was quite happy to take all those things away.
Well, Usman Ali, this idea of, you know, everything being short-term now and people having to plan for a certain amount of instability is quite a serious concern, obviously. And I wonder how young people are being prepared for it, being allowed to gear up for the idea that the contracts may be short-term, that, you know, there is no security guaranteed in employment.
That's if they get a job in the first place. Obviously, jobs aren't available, places in university aren't even available, education maintenance allowance being cut, and that obviously benefit a huge amount of people going to further education then to progress into higher education. So there's the huge instability in terms of the job market, and that aspiration being cut at the same time.
But how the impact of this kind of situation where people are facing austerity measures is that they postpone having children longer and longer, and of course that affects the voter, well, not just the voter base, I should say, but affects the social base of young people. The demographics change, and it's an older generation that's dependent on income from a younger generation that's dwindling.
I don't necessarily think that's true, but what I do think is that in terms of what the government is trying to do is ensure that family is back at the centre of values. We think that there is something called society. That society also exists within the family, and we should be giving families, which have felt actually over the last maybe 25 years, that they've been given a raw deal, and it's time to put them back into the centre of the argument again.
But demographics are changing, though, aren't they?
The demographics are changing, and actually you're absolutely right. People are less inclined to have children if, and this is sort of proven through sort of huge studies, that if they don't have stable jobs, then men and women then sort of don't marry and have children. And if they don't have the houses we've been building in this country, 50% of our housing stock over the last 10 years have been 1- and 2-bedroom flats. You can't really have a family in a 1 or 2 bedroom flat. And so at the moment, this sounds like words. And actually from Labour, the Labour government, it was also the same thing. They didn't really understand that you have to provide certain things. And that means interacting with the market. So you can't just leave it to housing developers to build family houses. They won't. And if they do, they'll charge you through the roof for it. And young people can't afford that at the start of their lives.
And Ben, the idea is also that if you have a smaller population in the workforce, because there is a dwindling young generation, presumably they have to carry a bigger burden when it comes to funding the functioning of the country, i.e. taxes would presumably have to go up for those people.
In the longer term, yes, the economic model would say that. But coming back to what we were just talking about, if there is a increase in the richness of a population, there is a correlation with the reduction in the number of children being produced by that population. So I don't think necessarily the statistic, if you look at one part of the statistics, yes, it might say that, but let's look at the wider trends here. One of the critiques about the book itself is that let's look actually not at 1979, let's look before that. Let's look at the 1970s. And we're talking about a population where, you know, there was 3-day working weeks, there was mass general strikes, there was, Osman was saying that we've never seen such strikes on our streets. In fact, well, have you looked back at the 1970s and those tremendously awful strikes? Let's look at it in context, a longer term context.
Okay, I want to get, Usman, a question to you that came in from Manchester from a student in the United Kingdom here, Sean Lamrick, who wrote in saying, young educated Britons are emerging as the lost generation, no doubt about it. Government cutbacks are forcing universities to give posts to international students over those from the UK and the EU. The UK's young are being treated as second-class citizens in their own country. Has it really gone that far?
In comparison to international students, I would say no, because with the international students, the numbers aren't capped and it doesn't take the place of a young person going into higher education. The cap itself comes from the coalition government, which is then put in place at the universities, and that's where the situation is, that less places are being given to people to go into higher education, and that's what's causing the problem.
And a quick thought as well, Ben, the issue of immigration is one that, of course, a lot of people point fingers at immigration and say that policies now have allowed there to be a much more dependent element in the community. They're not so entrepreneurial, and that, of course, takes away from funds from education and so on. Has that ever been raised as an issue that might be addressed to help the younger generation here already in the schooling system?
Immigration has been a problem over the last decade. We've said that we should no longer have immigration at the hundreds of thousands, but at the tens of thousands. That's been agreed upon in the coalition agreements. I don't necessarily think that if there's less people coming into the country, we're less entrepreneurial. I think there's there's necessarily less resources available in terms of labour force, but I don't think that kind of is a massive correlation there, no.
Okay. Shiv Malik, why is it, do you think, that the spike and boom of population trends, as you call them, has been, well, as you put it, swept under the carpet? When there have been predictable population trends, why do you think they've been ignored?
I think this, I mean, what we do know is that people are living longer than ever, certainly sort of in Western countries, across the world, in fact. People are living longer than ever, and the expected life expectancy has gone up every single year. And it's been quite predictable, as you said. Politicians have kind of ignored it because actually it raises very uncomfortable things about long-term decision-making. And so when these things were raised about pensions, for example, so how and the same thing as in America, again, across developed countries, how are we going to pay for all of these things like healthcare and pensions? No one wants to know, because actually voters, when you sort of put it to them that, you know, hey, your taxes might have to go up, they suddenly get very turned off very quickly. So that's why these things have been swept under the carpet. It's
also interesting how you say that there's an issue of asset transference, the inheritance, that young people are getting less and less from the older generation because they're living longer, they need to hang on to it for longer. And you create another situation where the young have been deprived from another area where they often depend on getting perhaps a home from their parents or something.
That's right. In terms of our own property laws here, they're all being written with the idea that people would die when they're about 60. And if people are not dying like they used to, is the polite way to put it, then we've really got to wonder about, you know, how do we transfer these things between generations? Do we need to sort of build more, make sure that there's more capital to go around so everything's sort of fairer? Or what do we do? How do we tackle these things? It's a real problem.
Usman Ali, just a thought with seeing what's happening on the streets of Britain right now. A quick thought, really. We've got about 30 seconds to go. Do you see the temperature rising among students? Do you expect this is something that's going to continue in the news, or can we see it settling down?
I hope in terms of the violence it settles down itself, but in terms of the issues, the protests will continue, and hopefully it'll be the issues which are on the television rather than the acts of violence itself.
But do you see that? I mean, do you get a sense in the student community that the action definitely hasn't stopped? That they're going to find a solution this way?
I hope so, yeah.
All right.
I hope the protests will continue, and what we're getting from student unions and students across the country, that protests will continue.
Of course, gentlemen, there's so much to discuss here, and it's a deep topic, but I thank you very much for your part. Ben Hallett, Usman Ali and Shiv Malik, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you for being with us too, of course, with your questions from around the world. Now, be sure to follow the programme on Facebook, where you'll find recent shows and updates on what we're doing next. You can also post your questions and comments for our guests. On the next show, we'll speak with award-winning playwright Tom Stoppard about his use of theatre to take on the president of Belarus, a man he calls the last dictator in Europe, to quote him. Make sure you tune in for that. From me and the team in London and in DC, we'll see you next time.